Focus of today's lecture will be on the hypothetical-deductive method. Now, since we have already established that research is actually a step-by-step process to maybe solve a problem, to maybe sustain what you already have, and to grow and develop. As we gave an example in the last lecture that why does Google, why does Apple, why does Microsoft, Oracle, these big companies, why do they invest billions of their hard-earned dollars in research when they are the top companies in the world? Now, the reason being that they want to sustain their performance, they want to improve on their performance, they want to develop their companies and grow bigger. Now, in order to do this, they will obviously be involved in certain kind of research. Now, that research may not only be limited to technological research, but also research related to employees. Now, how can we make sure that our employees continue to grow, continue to contribute to the organization? Now, in this whole process, they would assume that, okay, our hypothesis is that these or a particular kind of factors may impact the growth or may impact the development of employees. So keeping in mind business research, we have this 7-step process in the hypothetical-deductive method that involves actually different steps from identifying the area of research till the interpretation of data. So we'll be discussing all these steps in detail today. So the hypothetical-deductive method involves 7 steps, and the steps are identifying the broad problem area, defining the problem statement, and based on the problem statement, you develop a hypothesis. Then you develop measures to test the hypothetical relationship between variables. Now, how would you measure the variables? You need to measure the variables. What makes them take varying values, or what sort of values do they take? Then you collect the data on those variables, analyze data using different softwares, and then you interpret the data. Now, the first step is identifying the broad problem area. So for instance, you are in an organization and your organization is faced with people leaving the organization. Maybe your sales are decreasing. Maybe the customers are switching. Maybe the complaints are going up. Any problem that your organization may be facing. Maybe your performance is going down and you are not obviously able to attract more and more customers. So now there is definitely a problem in your organization. So how would you solve this problem? So the first step in any research is identifying the broad problem area. Now, what the examples that I've given actually relate to the problems that are faced by the organizations. Now, there might be a time, or for instance, you are conducting a basic research. Now, how do you identify a broad problem area in that particular context when you are conducting a basic research, maybe a research for your own thesis? Now, in order to do this, or in order to identify a broad problem area in your maybe in your for your degree or for your research thesis, the first thing you have to do is identify the area for your research. For instance, some of you might be interested in project knowledge management. Others might be interested in project human resource management. Somebody might be interested in leadership. Somebody might be interested in intellectual capital. Somebody might be interested in, for instance, organizational performance, financial performance of the organization. Somebody might be interested in economic growth, foreign direct investment. Now, these are areas that one is interested in or one might be interested in. Now, the first step is you have to go back to the literature. You have to identify what literature is available in this particular area. Now, what work is being done or has been done in this particular area. So this is your first step. You have to identify what work has been done in this area. Now, how do you identify that what work has been done in this area? now you have to go to these databases that we have where people publish their research. There are a number of databases that one can search for, and then one can identify, okay, this is what has been done. This is what research has been done by existing researchers. For example, if I'm interested in, say, leadership or in a particular style of leadership, which might be servant leadership, we are going to do a detailed lecture on searching through those databases, identifying the area where we can find, okay, what research has been done. How do you obviously base your research on existing research by identifying the limitations? So first let's go through these 7 steps, and then obviously we'll be going into detail how these 7 steps or these steps are implemented. So you go into these databases, and then you search for what work has been done in that particular area. So for instance, let me show you a research paper where you can see or assess how it's written that what particular research has been done. So let me open a paper. Okay, this is one of my papers that you can see on your screen. Development and validation of servant leadership skill in Spanish higher education. Now, what I did was I was studying through servant leadership. And then obviously while studying through servant leadership, I assessed or I observed that there is very little work on servant leadership in higher education. So by further digging deep into these research papers, I found out, well, there's no research that assesses or develops or validates a scale to measure servant leadership in higher education. So once I started digging into existing research, I found out a gap, a problem in existing research, a limitation of existing research, which is later expressed in these research papers. For instance, this is how I expressed it. Research on servant leadership has primarily focused on business organization with relatively scarce research on context of higher education. And then you elaborate as to why higher education might be an interesting area, an important area to study. Now, again, if you look at the next paragraph, it talks about the existing research available in this area and what research is available. Now, why this research is important? Servant leadership has a significant utility in higher education institutions, further explaining the need to study servant leadership in higher education. And since I've already mentioned that you need to focus on the limitations of existing research, because this is going to stimulate the need for your research. By identifying that what are the limitations of existing research, you are actually explaining or expressing why there is a need for you to conduct this research. So how do you do this? You have to do it through strong references from existing research. In this case, what I've done is I've mentioned that according to Van Der Donk and others 2014, servant leadership is in a relatively early stage. So there is a need for further research, and its research is significantly limited. And the empirical evidence on the outcomes of leadership still, it's fairly scarce. So this is how you express that, okay, yes, there is a problem existing in the existing research. The body of knowledge is significantly limited. There is limited research in the existing body of knowledge. So what you need to do is you need to first identify the problem area. How do you identify this problem area? For instance, this is one paper that you have downloaded. Okay, now this paper has done a research and has tested a model. And this is the model that they have tested. Now you cannot replicate this same paper because that will be very limited contribution to existing research. And this problem has already been solved. So you need to obviously build on this model, improve this model. So whenever you get hold of a paper, a research paper, we'll be looking into that in a short while. Where do you find these papers? So once you have these papers with you, so they have tested a particular model. Now you build onto that model. Now, how do you build onto that model? How do you improve the existing research? How do you add to existing research? In every single in a good paper, what you will find at the end of that particular paper is limitations and future research direction. Now, this section highlights what are the limitations of existing research and what are the existing researchers proposing to be done in future. Now, if you look into this paragraph, if you look into detail of this paragraph, if you read through this paragraph, it will guide you how to step up the existing research, how to improve the existing research, how to build onto the existing research. Now, let's go through this paragraph. The study has certain limitations that shall be highlighted. The first limitation is the study had a relatively small sample size. Now, if you use the same model and if you build onto this sample size, obviously this is a very small contribution to existing research. You are not solving a big problem. So you need to add to this. In future studies, obviously they are recommending a larger sample size. This is a cross-sectional study. Now, what is a cross-sectional study? Done at one single point in time, data collected at one point in time. The opposite to this is longitudinal study, where you collect data at multiple points in time. For instance, you have collected data at the start of the financial year. Then you collect data in the mid of the financial year. Then you collect the data at the end of the financial year. In this case, we did it in education sector. So you can collect data right at the start of the semester, in the mid of the semester, or in the end of the semester. Now, the study utilized a sample from higher education, so this study could be replicated into others. But the most important contribution or the most important problem that one could solve is adding new variables into this study. Identifying how this particular relationship or how a particular variable can influence other variables. Now, if you see, the focus of the present study was on assessing the impact of servant leadership on life satisfaction with mediating role of career satisfaction. So there was one mediator and one dependent variable. We'll be discussing the mediators in detail later. But the study actually assessed the impact of servant leadership on two variables: life satisfaction, career satisfaction. So this study now recommends that other variables such as self-efficacy, promotion focus, career commitment, empowerment at work, work-life enrichment, job stress, and employee well-being can also be serve as a mediators between these variables. These variables can also be studied in relation to servant leadership and life satisfaction. So what you can do is you can build onto this model, remove career satisfaction as mediator in the model, and add these variables. For instance, in this model now, if you see on your screen, instead of this career satisfaction, I can add career commitment, I can add self-efficacy, I can add promotion focus. So these are the variables that can be added onto this study. Now, the study only assess the impact of single leadership style. Now you can have multiple leadership style and do a comparative study on how these leadership styles can influence these variables. So, and further, the relationship of the present study was not as expected. So the problem is not still solved. We expected that the relationship between these variables would be positive, but instead we found a negative relationship. So now in no way we have found a conclusive evidence about this. So what we need to do is we need to obviously conduct further research as to find out how these variables are actually related to each other. So the crux is to find a particular problem to study, is that there should be a need to study that particular area. There should be limited research in that particular area. So how do you identify your problem area? So in order to identify your problem area or build onto your problem area in basic research is to identify the relationship that has not been studied in existing research, and then build onto your model and further develop that particular area. Now, the next step is you have to define your problem statement. So you have identified that, okay, this is a problem that I want to solve. This is the problem that I want to study. These are the variables that I want to study. Now, the next step is to clearly specify, describe your problem that you need to assess, you need to solve, that you need to address. So this helps you develop a particular aim or particular focus for your research. In this case, for instance, as you can see, the problem statement was to assess the mediating role of career satisfaction on the linkage between servant leadership and life satisfaction. So this was the problem that we wanted to assess. What if I change this variable career focus or career satisfaction to self-efficacy in the next research? So what would be my problem statement then? So my problem statement would then be to assess the mediating role of self-efficacy on the relationship between servant leadership and life satisfaction. So this problem statement is very concise, very clear, very focused. We will be having a detailed lecture on describing the problem statement. But for now, you should understand that problem statement refers to a statement, a clear sense of purpose, a clear sense of direction as to what relationships you want to study. So your problem area is, why is it necessary to study these particular relationships? What are the gaps prevalent in existing research? What are the limitations of existing research? The next step is you have to define your problem statement, give a clear, concise purpose for your study. Identify what are you intending to do? What are your intentions? We'll be discussing all these points in detail. This is actually the crux of your course as well. So we'll be discussing all these steps in greater detail, that how do you go to existing research and identify the problem area? Where are these research papers? What are these databases? So we'll be discussing these in greater detail in coming videos and coming sessions. So you have to define your problem statement. The next step is, once you define your problem statement, okay, this is the problem I want to solve. So in empirical research, something that is based on facts, you have to develop your hypothesis. The next step is that, okay, these are the variables that I want to study: servant leadership, self-efficacy, and life satisfaction. These are the three variables that I want to study. A variable is anything that can take varying values. So why servant leadership is a variable? Why say career satisfaction or self-efficacy is a variable? Or why life satisfaction is a variable? Now these are variables because your perception of your leader would be different from the perception of your colleagues, or your satisfaction from your career would obviously be different from your colleagues or your seniors or your juniors maybe. So that's why these particular concepts are referred to as variables. So the next step is you have to develop your hypothesis. You have to identify how these variables are related. So you develop a clear statement in which you describe how these variables are related. Again, we have a whole session, a whole chapter in which we'll be discussing these hypotheses. So hypothesis is an educated guess. Why it's educated? Because it's based on existing literature. You focus on existing literature, you base your problem statement onto what research is available, what people have described of how these variables are related to each other. So based on what is available in the literature, based on the theory, you develop your hypothesis. And these hypotheses are further tested. So the network of association identified among the variable is then theoretically woven. So you justify as to how these variables are related. For instance, if I can show you quickly. Now these okay, here are, just bear with me. Okay, now here is a hypothesis in which we are describing how these variables are related. But you can't do it on your own. You have to base it on existing research. So what I did is, for instance, here is another one: career satisfaction and life satisfaction. So career, we assume that career satisfaction positively impacts life satisfaction. But what are the basis of our assumption? Why are we saying that career satisfaction positively impacts life satisfaction? So your development of this hypothesis is based on your literature. Now, how do you write this? Obviously, this will be coming in our future lectures. So the next step is, once you have developed your hypothesis, the next is, how do you measure your variables? Because in order to test your hypothesis, you need to measure your variables. For example, what do you mean by measuring? Let's say I say that, okay, Mr. A weighs higher than Mr. B. Now, how would you make sure that yes, this is true? So you have to have a measuring machine or a weight machine. So the weight machine is used to measure weight. So weight is a variable which is measured through a weight machine. So you put person A onto the machine, note its weight. Then you put the person 2 onto the weight. Okay, height is another variable that obviously height is another variable that we can use to assess. Now, so if we say that, okay, my height is obviously significantly or maybe lower than your height or is less than your height. So how would you determine that, okay, yes, my height is less? So in order to do this, how do you do this? Just hold on. Okay, so you need measures to obviously measure your variable. For instance, in this case, or in the example I was referring to, we were focused on servant leadership or self-efficacy or life satisfaction. So how do you measure servant leadership? You need a particular questionnaire to measure servant leadership. In our case, we had this questionnaire, which you can see. Obviously, we asked certain questions with regards to servant leadership. Here are the questions. So these questions help us measure servant leadership. Similarly, we had question for career satisfaction, and similarly, we had question for life satisfaction. So using those questions, we measured servant leadership. Now, how do you get these questions? What are the sources of these questions? Here are the sources of these questions. So obviously we'll be discussing these things in further detail as well. For now, just let's discuss what is hypothetico-deductive method. Now the next step is, once you have identified the measure for your variables, once you have identified, okay, this is how I'm going to measure my variable, this is how I'm going to assess whether there is servant leadership in the organization or not, whether or not people are satisfied with their career or not, whether they are satisfied with their lives or not. So once you have done this, the next step is collecting the data. So you go out in the field and you have identified your respondents. Now, again, and this will be done in greater detail as to how to identify your respondent. This is sampling technique. We have a whole session coming up on that as well. So how do you identify uh, your respondents? That will be done later. The sampling techniques will be discussed later in greater detail. So you go out and you collect your data. So once you collect your data and you've got your data, the next step is analysis of data, identifying whether the hypothesis that you proposed actually are supported or not. So there are different tools that are used for analysis. There is SPSS, there is structure equation modeling done through AMOS, Smart PLS, Literal, M+, there are multitude of softwares. We will be discussing those as well. And then once you have your results, you interpret the data, whether or not your hypothesis was supported or whether they were rejected. So, and then you, in the final state, you present your results. So this is how hypothetical-deductive method works. There are 7 steps, starting from your broad problem area and ending through the interpretation and presentation of your results. So the first thing is you identify the problem area. You identify, okay, this is the need of research. This is what needs to be done. The second is you define your problem statement. Second, you develop. Third, you develop your hypothesis. Once you develop your hypothesis, the next step is identifying how would you measure the variables. Once you identify this is how I'm going to measure the variables, you start collecting data, then you analyze it, and then you interpret it.